Hey guys, welcome to the next lecture. In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to use the textures panel to enhance your materials. And we're going to start off with the default cube scene here. I'm going to run into the materials panel and let's go ahead and move this light over here. We're going to make it something like a sun lamp. Kind of bring this back, bring this up. Let's actually switch this to an area lamp. Bring this down to 10. Samples up to 8. Bring this up a little bit. And bring the saw size up to 4. Now I'm going to go ahead and create a plane that is directly under this cube, just so we got something for it to sit on. And let's go ahead and take this camera, move it in a little bit to there. Okay, so let's got this cube. Let's try to render this, see what it looks like. Okay, so we got a basic cube going here. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys what the textures tab will do. If you've got a material already selected in the materials tab here, if you pop right over to the texture panel, it's going to have a texture already default created for you for the material. Let's first go over these 3 little buttons here at the top of the screen. These are going to change how you are adjusting textures based on their application in your scene. So right on the far left here, we've got world textures. Right now, we don't have any world textures applied, but this would be something like background environments, HDR images, things like that you're going to use to light the scene with, or just backdrops for things you're seeing like clouds. Over here, we've got the materials textures display, which is going to show textures that are applied to materials that you're currently using for the object you've got selected. So all the textures for the cube are listed right here. And then we've got this textures display here, which is going to specifically allow us to choose the textures we want to modify, and then it's going to let us just tweak all the settings for those textures regardless of what the application is. So I'm going to switch back to the materials layout for this. Now we've created this default texture here, and right now we've set it to a type of none. So let's name this cube texture real fast, just so we have a name for it. And let's go over this type drop down. The type setting is going to tell Blender what kind of texture you're trying to create. So there's a lot of options here, but the one that you're probably going to be using most often if you're creating custom textures for your models by painting them is the image or movie option here. The ones that are left in here are textures that are being generated on the fly in Blender and can be useful if you're doing some more procedural texturing, which we'll go over in the next section. So let's go ahead and pop in here and look at something like clouds. So we select clouds here. Again, we've got this preview option, and this is the same preview that you're going to be seeing when you're over here in the material preview. So you can show texture that you're working on, the material as it's applied to the material, or both at the same time. And so as you can see, just by changing this to the type of cloud, it's generating this basic cloud texture, and then Blender is mapping that automatically to our cube in this case. So if we render this now, you're going to get a basic cloud overlay onto the cube. And so let's go over some of the other options we have here. I'm going to collapse these just so we can see them. Colors is going to allow you to assign and adjust colors for the map itself. By default, if you jump into this influence tab, it's going to use this pink value here. If you switch that, it's going to change how this is mapped to the cube. And so if you want to change how this works, you can come in here and instead select color, and then it's going to automatically assign this sort of rainbow color to your texture, and then it will use that instead. So again, you can modify that by going in here And under colors, you can select ramp, and it will allow you to create a fade from one color to the next. So if you just check ramp and then turn that on, it's going to use a black to white, and the black's going to be turned all the way down with the alpha so that it's not visible. So it's actually fading from this white to transparent. So if we crank the alpha back up on this black, you're going to get that back, and then you can see we got this black and white cloud. So that's how you would use the ramp settings. You can also adjust brightness, contrast. If we turn this up here, crank the contrast, it's going to kind of affect that a little bit. Let's turn that back off, change this to grayscale again, so you can see this happening. See what brightness and contrast do there. If you hold shift when you're sliding through these values, it'll slow it down a little bit, so you can increment these a little bit less than all at once. And so you can change those, and it will kind of affect how that's gonna work on your model. So there we go. So let's go in here and let's talk about some of the other sliders. Now, soft is going to leave you with a cloud type that is pretty soft in terms of the edges. So let's scale this up so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Again, you want to hold shift if you want to make these subtle slider changes. So now if we render that, you can see it's blown up a little bigger. You can see the cloud details. Now if you want to add more detail back into that texture, you can up this depth value, and it will add a little bit more subtlety in there. And okay, so we got soft, which is the type you see here, and then we got hard, which will create these kind of hard fall off edges. A little more like you'd see in an explosion. And then you've also got these options for the basis down here. Now by default, that's going to be a Blender Original, but you can also switch to Veroni effects or cell noise, things like that, which will allow you to render some really interesting effects. That's a pixelated sort of effect. You could also do Veroni crackle, which is kind of cool. Kind of gives you a nice little organic effect there with the texture. And so that's kind of it for these. Now again, this is going to change depending on the type of texture that you're generating. So if you come in here and select wood instead of cloud, you're going to get a whole new set of options for how to tweak these settings, which you can see there. So the best advice I can give you is to come in here and start with a texture type and then play with the settings under that specific texture type until you can come up with a setting that works for what you're trying to do. If you're trying to stay procedural, that's the best advice I can give you. If you want to get a lot more specific in the way that the textures look on your model, I would use a UV texture, which we're going to go over in the next couple of lectures. And that's the way you want to use to control how these textures actually look specifically edge to edge on your model. Let's go back to clouds and go back through these settings. So again, we got our cloud texture here, got that rendered, and so let's talk about the mapping real fast. Mapping is by default going to be set to generated for the coordinates, and this is basically going to create an original texture map for the object, again on the fly, and it's going to just throw something on there according to the way that Blender sees it in your scene. Now, when we get into UV mapping, we'll switch this to UV, and that's pretty much the only two options you'll probably come in here and use when you're starting out. UV mapping is what you'll use probably 90% of the time if you're going to be generating any kind of custom texture. And once you've got UVs on your model, you can click UV here, and it will use that instead of generated for mapping it to your model. One of the other things you can do in here is change the size. If I change it to something less than 1, like a 0.5, it'll blow this texture up, make it bigger and stretch it. If I go to something higher, like 3 instead of value for 1 for all of these, it'll scale my texture down and apply more of it to the object. So if you're using procedural mapping and you've got a seamless texture or texture that you've generated in Blender, You can change this to whatever you want, and you're not going to have any seams, any problems. It's just going to continue to generate an infinite texture and successfully wrap this around your object and make it look great. So there you go. I changed it to 10, got really small. Now we got a lot more detail on this object. And the last thing we'll go over in the texturing panel is this influence tab. Now right now you can see the only box I have checked is color. So what this is telling Blender is that the texture that I'm generating here, that we're applying back to the material, is only going to affect the color of the material itself. It's not going to affect highlights, other shading, whether or not there's bumps on the texture itself of the material. And so this is only using the color. So when we render this, it's going to use the black and white to affect this, and that's it. Now if I turn on alpha and take this color off, and then we have transparency turned on, take this down to 0. Without this texture, this would now be completely gone. Let's go ahead and get rid of this one real fast. If I was to just go ahead and render this right now, nothing's there. Okay, so this render's done now. As you can see, without the texture on there, and we just turned on transparency, and then crank that alpha all the way down to 0 so it's 100% transparent. It's just casting a shadow and there's nothing there. So what we can do now is come back here, add a new texture. We're going to leave the clouds turned on, but instead of color, we're going to let it affect the alpha and have that all the way up. Now one thing you'll have to do is make sure that under colors, if you do have a ramp on, that you have taken this and the alpha is gone all the way back down to 0. If this is at 1 and you try to render this, you're going to get a solid object. Again, you're not going to see the cloud texture because it's only using the information of the transparency to affect this, not the color. So if I take this back down to 0, so that part of that texture has transparency and the white parts don't, and now we render it, you're going to be able to see through that for all the parts that are black, and you're going to be able to see the cube in entirety where there's white parts. Okay, so you can see that happening a little bit down here. To make this a little bit more a standout effect that you can actually see what's going on, I'm going to go ahead and crank the size up again, and then we're going to bring this alpha value up to where we definitely have some parts down here that are 100% transparent, and let's render that again. Okay, so as you can see here, we've got a couple of sections here where you can actually see through the cube and into the shadow that it's casting back here. Again, I'm going to crank this way up, so we've got a lot more going on there, and bring that back down, depth up. Let's let that render again. So as you can see, we've definitely got that cast shadow that's back there from the cube onto the ground, but all these edges are disappearing, and it's only really showing us what is white on this cloud map. So as you can see, depending on what you want to affect, that's just with alpha checked. You can also check all these other boxes, let it just affect the highlights, let it affect the bump on something. So I've got color turned back on. Let's go back over here, crank the alpha back up, and then let's pull this back down a little bit so we got a little less contrast. And now we've got our white back on here. Now what I'm going to do is turn the alpha back up so we got some more of that black in there. Render that again. Alright, so we've got our basic black and white cloud texture thrown back on there. Now if we wanted to let this affect the color and the bump of our object, what we could do is turn on this normal setting under geometry, and one is pretty high, so that if we pull this down to something like 0.3, and let's just render part of this cube instead of all of it, so we can speed this up a little bit. I don't know if you can tell, but right in here you can see it's added a little bit of texture on this cube that's raised and recessed based on that cloud texture. So again, if we do crank this up pretty high to something like 1, you can really see how rocky this is looking now. And so if we just take color off and let it apply those bumps to the normal. Okay, so let's render this whole thing. Okay, so you can see the effect we're getting here with color turned off and this geometry normal slider turned on. We're taking this cloud texture and putting it onto the bumpiness of the material. So we're going to get the material, and then the bump is going to be generated by that cloud texture. So if we bring this into more of like a red tone that you would find on a rock, something like this, and then we render this, you're going to very quickly get something that looks like a rock with that render. And so again, this is sort of our step into procedural texturing with this textures panel. And again, this is all being generated on the fly. There's no need to use external files or anything like that. All this is being done inside Blender, and no matter what size you make this, it's going to keep that integrity. So if we go back to mapping and we change this to 5 to make this shrink down, you're going to get a much different effect based on how you scale that. So you can see how that looks. Now for this, we'll bring the bump back down to something like 0.25. Let's try that. Okay, and there you go. You've got a nice little bump texture that's still applied. We'll bring the normal back down, and it's a little more subtle than it was. And so that's going to do it for the texture layout panel. And in the next section, we can use a texturing process called procedural texturing, which is the simplest type of texturing in 3D. And we're going to build another material. So I'll see you there.